In this lecture, we're going to examine structures of political and social hierarchy in what we're going to refer to as Feudal Japan. I should start by mentioning that some historians prefer not to use the terms feudal or feudalism when discussing Japanese history. We're going to use this term in this course because it's what your textbook refers to, so I'm trying to be consistent with the way things align. Some historians argue that Japanese social and political structures were heavily dependent upon powerful families, as opposed to the case of European feudalism, which was based on a set of mutual obligations in which family ties were much less important than the loyalty of vassals to lords, V-A-S-S-A-L-S. In addition, for the most part, the European monarchs possessed significantly more power than Japanese emperors during the era that we're going to refer to as Feudal Japan. Japanese emperors at this time were largely figureheads. As we will see, there were also significant differences in the role of agricultural producers in European and Japanese systems at the time. Unlike European feudalism, with peasants or serfs at the bottom, the Japanese feudal class structure featured merchants on the lowest levels. At times in Japanese history, merchants were almost considered parasitic, since they did not actually produce a good, but rather factored in profits for their own income. Confucian traditions had long stressed the importance of the productive members of society, at least as they were defined back then. So farmers and fishermen typically possessed higher socioeconomic status than merchants in Japan, though in terms of wealth, merchants certainly might have greater wealth than a poor peasant agriculturalist. You'll note also the presence of a category that we can call either the burakumin or the eta. These were outcasts, or people who were sort of beyond the caste system. Although, again, the term caste, we tend to think of India, and the formal caste structures there was not quite as well defined as that. But the outcast individuals had jobs tainted with death or with impurity, jobs such as executioners, people who worked in slaughterhouses, as undertakers, as butchers or tanners, and this became something of a hereditary class of people. If you're traveling in Japan, I would not use the term Eta or Burakumin. If you run into a person, you're liable to run into some interpersonal social difficulty if you use that term. It carries much more of a deep-seated connotation, even than a term like redneck would in the United States. The samurai, whose name translates roughly as to serve, was originally the dominant warrior class in Japanese society. Feudal Japanese society was dominated by the samurai warrior class. Although the samurai were only about 10% of the population, they possessed considerable power. When a samurai passed on the street, for example, members of lower classes were supposed to bow and demonstrate respect. If farmers or merchants, for example, refused to bow to samurai, the samurai was legally entitled to decapitate the offending person, at least through the 16th and 17th centuries. The samurai followed a set of rules known as Bushido, B-U-S-H-I-D-O. Some of the expectations of the Bushido code are as follows. They were expected to practice frugality, or not to live lavish lifestyles or wasteful lifestyles. Loyalty was an important component of the Bushido code, and loyalty especially to their superiors, the Daimyo, which we'll get to in a moment. They were expected to have a mastery of the martial arts. They were expected to maintain honor even unto death. If a samurai failed to uphold his honor, and by extension the Bushido code, that person could only regain it by performing a form of ritual suicide known as seppuku, S-E-P-P-U-K-U. And the samurai were subservient in the Japanese social hierarchy and in a political sense also to the next group we're going to discuss, which are the Daimyo. The term Daimyo translates in practice as a great name, but the etymological roots of the word have more to do with large land holdings, so great private land holding. The term emerged in wide usage in approximately the 10th century CE. Daimyo possessed military powers, executive powers, police powers, and they were akin to something like a combination of a general and a governor in American political traditions. They were powerful territorial rulers who acted in much the same way as European lords, as we will see when we get back to feudal Europe. Daimyos controlled land usage. They constructed castles and retained warriors. They hired agriculturalists and craftsmen on their territory. Their land holdings were known as Han, H-A-N. Daimyo typically hired samurai to guard their land and protect their land holdings, and they often paid samurai in land or in food. Few daimyo at this time could afford to pay samurai in cash, and again, this was not a strong cash-based economy at the time, and the possession of cash itself, as in the case of merchants, was seen as perhaps at least a little bit suspicious. While daimyos possessed autonomy in their own Han, they were still subordinate to central authority, at least in theory. The next level up in the hierarchy that we're going to discuss, the Shogun. The name translates as military commander, so something akin to a general. It first found use in the very late 8th century CE. The actual title, Sei I Taishogun, translates as great general who subdues eastern barbarians. This was often, but not always, a hereditary title passed from father to eldest son. Nominally, the shogun was appointed by the emperor, but in many cases the emperors of Japan faced significant pressure to confer the title of shogun. After all, the shogun controlled the vast military forces of the empire. Some shoguns, in essence, became de facto rulers of Japan. The Kamakura era in Japanese history is marked by significant shifts in political and social structures. The government, for example, moved from Kyoto, which you can see a little west of modern-day Tokyo, to Kamakura City in order to minimize the power, the entrenched power of aristocrats and also Buddhist leaders in Kyoto. The Kamakura era was also noted for the adoption of what became known as the Joi Code, J-O-E-I, in 1232 CE. This legal code provided for just and impartial due process of law to vassals, or those who were obliged to serve others. The Joi Code set in place standardized laws regarding religion, land disputes, criminal offenses. Governors of provinces exercised jurisdiction in a number of legal areas under the Joi Code, and they were not necessarily required to refer all matters to central authorities, especially issues more of a local in scope. Under the Joi Code, some crimes, the guilt of the husband extended to the wife. The crime of forgery, for example, provides some insights into the focus of the Joi Code. A samurai who was convicted of forgery faced the confiscation of his land, while a samurai without land would be sent into exile. However, members of lower socioeconomic classes, if convicted of forgery, would be branded in the face by a red-hot iron. Thus, while this was a modernization of legal standards, at least in a codification sense, the Joi Code was by no means an especially forward-looking or progressive legal movement. We reach a period during the Kamakura era in which the shoguns rise to new positions of authority and power. Remember, they had been sort of temporary before. They had been at least nominally appointed by the emperor, but it is during the Kamakura era that they become extremely powerful. The background to this, the leading clan was seen as corrupt, and there were calls to overthrow the leading clan, the imperial clan. There were wars between clans, so this is an era of widespread civil war. Emperors becoming more and more figureheads with seemingly no control over these competing large military forces roaming throughout the territory of Japan. And seizing the opportunity at this time was Minamoto no Yoritomo. Perhaps no shogun has had as much influence on the emerging power of this position as Minamoto no Yoritomo. Minamoto is the family name. He was Yoritomo was the heir of a powerful clan. He spent quite a few years in exile for opposing the imperial clan, and he rose to power in a period of great civil war between these rival clans. Yoritomo made the most of a call from the emperor for help against one particular rebellion, and when the young emperor unexpectedly died, in fact, he was drowned by a member of the royal family who didn't want to see the young emperor become a captive in this war. Yoritomo assumed authority to govern. Now, he did not achieve this authority overnight, and there were a number of rival clans who were unhappy about this, but in a very short order he was able to restore or bring an end to the chaos, restore order in Japan. Though his years as shogun were relatively short, Yoritomo established the authority of the warrior samurai class, and he established the first Bakufu at Kamakura. We'll discuss that in the next slide. Yoritomo assumed duties that were formerly reserved to aristocratic families, particularly with regard to war, foreign policy, and police functions. This period marks at least the official beginning for most historians of feudal Japan. But again, this term is there's no consensus among historians whether we can use the term interchangeably with Japan and Europe. The Bakufu translates literally as tent government. It referred to the headquarters, historically, of a general on a battlefield. And there's an implication here that this administration was meant to be temporary, because you know how tents work. You pitch them, you set them up, you can move them around, but they're not a permanent home, at least for most of us. The shogunate became associated with this term Bakufu, but largely the term Bakufu began to refer to the fact that this was a more permanent institution. Shoguns named military governors known as shugo, S-H-U-G-O, in the provinces. The imperial court at Kyoto still existed, but actual authority and real administrative functions were possessed from this point forward, at least till 1867, till the second two-thirds of the 19th century, possessed by the shoguns. And this brings to a close our brief examination of Japanese feudal social hierarchy.